This is Stigma, where we talk with leaders from many industries about how mental health and addiction have impacted their lives. Many people suffer silently from mental illness, addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma. They never seek help because of stigma. In this podcast, host Stephen Hayes and his guests share their stories of recovery in order to encourage others to do the same. Here's Stephen.
Welcome back to the Stigma Podcast. Today, we're talking about psychedelics. I'm your host, Stephen Hayes. Today's guest is Richard Scaife. He's the founder of the Conscious Fund, which invests in early-stage ventures in plant-powered medicine with a focus on psychedelics. To date, they have invested in startups such as Atai Life Sciences, Bexon Biomedical, Cybin, Gilgamesh, Hive, Microdose, Numinous, and a handful of others. So I'm excited to have him here today as a new investor in the space myself, and I'm going to let him explain to you a lot of what's going on in this industry from a regulatory perspective, give you the lay of the land, and tell you a little bit about where the space could be going in the future. So without further ado, Richard, thanks for being here, man.
Thank you very much for having me, Stephen.
So I wanted to ask you about your bio and background. I wasn't sure the best way to ask. So what's the more interesting story? Is it how you got into VC or how you got into psychedelics or both?
I guess the answer is pretty similar to both of them in that I had a couple of lucky breaks. And in fact, actually, I got into VC really by accident. It was about 20 years ago, and I replied to an advert in the back of one of the national newspapers in the UK. And just looked like your kind of average funky startup. So I traveled from the north of England, went to what's an area which is now known as Silicon Roundabout in the east of London. And I met this group of guys who were working from an apartment, and they said they wanted me to help them set up a skunkworks. And I said, that sounds absolutely amazing. I had no idea what a skunkworks was. So I went away, and I was going to say I Googled it, but I don't think there was Google at the time. So I Yahoo'd it and found out what a skunkworks was and what I was going to be doing. And then actually discovered it wasn't really a cool, funky startup. It was the corporate ventures arm of a very big mobile telephone operator. Went on to launch an initiative with 140 characters and an @ symbol with messages which get posted on a wall. And that wasn't called Twitter. It was actually called Uboot. And the business actually ended up pivoting, became a B2B player, and was actually sold for quite a lot of money. But I actually found myself in venture capital in the sort of the corporate ventures arm of a telco without even realizing that's what I was going to be doing with my life. And psychedelics really for me came through a love of trying to work in the sort of the mental health space and destigmatizing mental health. And post my time in corporate venture and a little bit of a period of time in the music industry, I set up a mobile app development studio. Initially, we were sort of work for hire, but we were working on the real sort of premium end of the market. So we looked after people like Aston Martin and Ferrari and a lot of the major music companies. And then we started to develop our own brands. And one of the brands that we developed was in the mental health space. It was called DigiPill. And this is about 7 or 8 years ago. And, this is at the same time that Headspace came to market and Calm came to market, all out of London. And, my mission really with that product was to make accessing meditation simple, fun, easy, and cool. And I went out and I spoke to the European VCs, and they said, we don't really think guided meditation is going to be a thing. Just kind of run it as your pet project. And of course, Calm and Headspace heard exactly the same, but they decided they'd jump on a plane and they flew to the west coast of America, and they've both created, very, very successful formats, which, are worth billions of dollars. So I guess for me, it was my biggest success and also my biggest failure combined, because I shouldn't have listened to what other people were telling me, because, at the time, there was 3 people fighting for the throne, but I followed the advice, and that's kind of how I didn't create $1 billion business in the mental health space. But that kind of really, for me, sealed though my sort of conviction. It was the only company I've ever been involved in where you used to get support emails, and people would be describing the sort of the positive impact that your products had on their life, and really, really heart-touching stories. So I always kind of said to myself, if I got chance to go back into venture, having been a partner in an early stage fund in London, mainly sort of doing consumer, but not stuff that I was hugely into. I wanted to be focused on working in mental health. And really, I saw psychedelics as being the bridge to that occurring. Trying to, in a way, do what I could have done many, many years ago, which is, help to make psychedelics, very, very accessible in the same way we tried to make guided meditation very, very accessible.
So one quick follow-up question there about Calm and Headspace. Why do you think those two ideas originated out of London? Is that a coincidence? Is there something different about the mental health ideas that are coming out of the UK versus the US?
No, it's really strange when you think about it, because the European venture community were not supporting those type of concepts. For them to go out and to raise, their much larger round of funding, they had to go out and do that in the US. We bootstrapped the DigiPill business, which is still on the App Store today and still gets, downloads and still live, but of course never became the product that Calm and Headspace did. And it's quite funny, really, because visually, we were all quite similar, but we all came out at exactly the same time. So it's not any suggestion that anybody copied anybody's, sort of brand identities. There was just three groups, in and around London who were creating almost, nearly identical products.
How did you go from where you were, working at a venture fund to where you are now, starting the Conscious Fund? Like, what was the path from one to the other?
I'd started to live between London and Malta. And Malta, for people who are not in Europe, is in Europe. And it's the smallest European member state, quite close to Sicily, but actually, geographically, is actually closer to Africa. And it's where a lot of funds come out of. It's been very progressive in terms of, new technology such as blockchain. And I was introduced to a family on the island who were working on a transaction to bring a medical cannabis company into the jurisdiction. And again, for people who are not familiar with the European landscape, we're considerably many years behind the US with regards to the adoption of medical cannabis, even now. So when Malta was doing this 2 and a bit years ago, it was incredibly progressive. The UK at this time had no patient access programs, full stop. So I remember thinking to myself, well, this is good. This is really good that this is happening, but I can't really see it being a thing in the UK. So I helped on the transaction. I did a lot of reading around the space. And I'd always had a passion, for sort of psychedelics. I'd spent 3 or 4 years of my professional career in the electronic music industry. I've been involved in throwing some very, very big electronic music events. So I think it's fair to say I'm trying to find a nice way of framing it. I'd seen what psychedelics can do to a large group of people who are all in the same location. And I was just by pure coincidence, a friend of mine who's general partner at a deep tech fund said, I want to introduce you to an entrepreneur who's from a Maltese background, so you may even possibly know each other. And, his background is plant-based medicine, but he wants to launch a venture capital fund. And because of your connection to Malta and, what you've done in VC in the past, I think you should meet and see if you can help him. So I said, yeah, no problems. And we met and, we got on very, very well. And before I knew it, I was part of the GP and I was helping to set up the Conscious Fund. And this was about a year ago. We wanted to do it on a fully disclosed basis, i.e. the regulator knew exactly what we were doing, the area that we were working in, and the same with every service provider. So it took, quite a bit of time to get everybody comfortable with, what we were actually doing and why we believe this was going to be a super important category. And we got our full regulatory approval in March of this year. So it took about 9-10 months. And then, of course, the world changed. Jumping on aeroplanes to go and see people was no longer an option. Everything became virtual. We'd already started to put money out into the space because deals were closing quicker than we could actually get the fund structure up. So we found some vehicles that we could use to deploy capital, and effectively the Conscious Fund was born.
That's great. So what's the focus area for the fund? I mean, is it a certain type of founder? Is it a certain stage, certain check size? Like, how would you articulate to the founders who should be approaching you?
We are very much a global fund. So we have team now in the US and in Canada. So we're happy to deploy capital globally. It's interesting, actually, that Europe has managed to create the two biggest psychedelic companies thus far, not the United States and not Canada. Compass Pathways originated from London and Atai originated from Berlin. So we would love to be able to say, we'd love to back more European founders, but there actually isn't a lot of psychedelic medicine companies coming out of Europe right now. Vast majority of them coming out of Canada, with a few coming out of the US. And I would say the US is starting to sort of raise. We like the super early side of things, but we like founders who've got a true background and a passion for this space. And you find some really, really interesting characters. So, people who've spent 20, 30 years of their life working inside big pharma have probably been doing interesting experiments in their garages at the weekend and now can actually carve themselves a career in psychedelic medicine. So we love those sort of teams, but we're not afraid to go very, very early and, to be writing checks alongside angels. But we've also had participation all the way up to B rounds as well.
Awesome. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the psychedelic space. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners, a lot of the investors out there, the angels, and even some of the founders, they still aren't quite up to speed on what's going on in this space. Could you talk a little bit about the space, maybe from the perspective of a kind of a little basic primer? I mean, why is everyone so hyped about psychedelics, and why is it an issue that the governments, have to get through a regulatory issue before we can use them?
Well, so I mean, it obviously, let's touch on it from a sort of a global basis. There is a perception in the United States that because currently psychedelics sit as a Schedule 1, that, companies who are developing psychedelic medicine are going to have to go through the sort of same pain as the cannabis industry had to, which is still, of course, not federally approved, is state by state. But actually, where this is fundamentally different is that, there are a number of not-for-profits and also for-profits who have managed to get FDA approval for fast track and breakthrough therapy status on the medicines that they're developing. So they have had their time to market significantly reduced because of the approach that they took with the FDA. So I think, for the US, we're going to see the first truly psychedelic medicines approved within the next sort of 2 years. And that's probably going to be someone like MAPS with their MDMA therapy for treatment-resistant PTSD. You already have federally approved psychedelic medicines on the market, such as ketamine, and there are around 300 to 500 clinics across the United States who are administering ketamine right now. So there is already a fully legal psychedelic market in existence in the United States already. Canada, very much like it did with the cannabis industry, is showing very, very positive signs in terms of Health Canada exceptions. Some very interesting news which came out very recently with regards to psilocybin being used as part of palliative care. There was 4 patients who were given a special exception, very much in the same way that medical cannabis 7 or 8 years ago started to get its first exception. So as a lot of people in Canada are saying, we can see similar trends in terms of what has happened in medical cannabis, we think the same is going to happen with psychedelic medicine. Europe, as I touched on earlier, has created the 2 biggest companies thus far. There's incredible work being done in a number of global universities. I mean, you have stuff coming out of Harvard, you have stuff coming out of Johns Hopkins, but incredible work coming out of Imperial in London, in Maastricht as well. But Europe is a little bit tougher in terms of actually getting medicines into patients. We do have ketamine approved therapy in a number of European jurisdictions, but actually getting a broader range of psychedelics will probably take a little bit longer in some European countries, but some are being a lot more progressive. MAPS are, working inside the Czech Republic and also working inside the Netherlands with regards to doing their final sort of phases for their MDMA.
So why are these other psychedelics outside of ketamine illegal everywhere? I mean, that's not a political thing in the United States. It's globally, these things are not okay, apparently. Well, how did that come to be?
Well, unfortunately, the United States does have a big part to play in that because, most countries are signatories to the 1961 United Nations Drug Convention, and drugs get listed on that schedule and then makes it very, very difficult for them to be lowered in their ranking, and then they are, perceived wrongly as having no medicinal benefit. So right now in the United Kingdom, we grade MDMA, psilocybin, alongside heroin and cocaine in terms of their use for medical practice, which is of course farcical. So that's part of the problem, is that the regulation on drugs is actually not purely a country by country basis.
How did they end up treated the same as these other drugs? How did that come to be? Who had a hand in that?
I think, again, it was probably fair to say the United States had a big hand in that.
Why was the US government so afraid of this drug in the mid-20th century? Is it just because people were using it recreationally and they didn't know what to do, so they banned it and they didn't think about it? Or was there with the pharma companies, saying, hey, we don't want this stuff to be, replacing all of our drugs, so we don't want it legal? Why are we here having to fight for this?
Well, I'm, as you can probably tell from the accent, I'm no expert on American history, but from what I'm told,
me neither. And I live here. Maybe maybe I'm the idiot. I don't know.
Vietnam had a large part to play. So you had the peace movements. Of course, there was the Summers of Love. That was LSD and magic mushrooms. So they got classified as Schedule 1. Then you saw MDMA, and there was incredible work being done with MDMA around therapy in the 1970s. A lot of research being done, and then it was embraced by the gay community, and then all of a sudden MDMA became exceptionally evil, and that became a Schedule 1 drug. So drugs which were connected to groups of people who were being deemed as not particularly beneficial to society, then those drugs were classified, and the highest levels of penalties were attached to them. And unfortunately, a lot of kind of drug policy that we see around the world right now has actually been driven by the American agenda. So there isn't necessarily a sort of a rationale as to why, some country who had got no connection with peace movements, the Vietnam War, would actually be classifying a drug in exactly the same way as the United States was.
So some politicians here got scared and then imposed their will on everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the great work which was happening, around psilocybin and LSD and MDMA was stopped. And it's only really now being, started officially. But what's been, I think, amazing to see is the quality of organizations in American academia who have created, real centers of excellence around, further continuing this research, because these are not new drugs that are being researched. The amount of information around efficacy, around safety, has already been done. Many, many years ago, there was just a 30, 40 year pause. And we have groups like MAPS and people like Rick Doblin, who heads up MAPS, to thank for a lot of that work now being restarted.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. So who has started this resurgence? Who turned the tide? It seems like, to me, the momentum is on the side of approval, a removal from Schedule 1. How did that change come about, and how long will it take? I mean, I think you said like a couple of years, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably talking about sort of on psilocybin, the USONA Institute, and with MAPS, I think we're probably talking 2.5 years before we see approved therapy and effectively the drug being, federally approved. But yeah, MAPS really were the forerunner in that. They've raised somewhere in the region of about $100 million as a not-for-profit, and, invested that into, doing all of the very, very valuable work that they've done around the clinical trials and around, lobbying. And it's, people say to me, well, it feels like this industry has been created overnight. And I say, well, it's hundreds, potentially thousands of years in the making. It's been 30 years in the recreation. And actually, it's actually been 6 months as the industry that we know right now.
What was that turning point to the end of the industry we know now? What would you say caused that change in the last 6 to 12 months?
Well, it's probably more 6 rather than 12 months. So, you've had companies, organizations like Compass, which started off as a not-for-profit and then became a for-profit. You had groups like Atai. And actually part of the reason that we had real conviction that this space was going to go somewhere is, I looked at who'd invested into people like Compass and into groups like Atai, which were blue chip American venture capital funds. And I could see there was a huge funding gap in that those folks like to write very, very big checks. Who's going to write the checks before them? Which was why we ultimately started, to put together the Conscious Fund. And the real sort of turning point was actually probably March this year. So in the very early part of this year, we could probably count on, if I had three hands, but I've only got two. But
maybe two hands and a foot.
Two hands and a foot. That's how many companies there were. There's Compass, there was Atai, MindMed had started to come to life. There was a few others. There was people who had been working on setting up a business for a number of years, but had not felt that the funding environment was going to receive them very, very well. Then, MindMed came out, all guns blazing. They got people like Bruce Linton on their team. They're going to go public. And all of a sudden, we went from two relatively discrete companies in the shape of Compass and Atai to MindMed being on US national TV, talking about psychedelic medicine and how they're going to be the first company to go public. And I think that then gave people the confidence who'd been working on things behind the scenes to say, hey, I'm a psychedelic medicine company as well. And really from there, it's grown now to a space where there is probably somewhere in the region of about 140, 160 companies all in all. But there are new businesses coming to fruition every single day. And not just groups who are working on, drug design and drug discovery, bringing medicines into the market. These are people who are doing amazing sort of ancillary businesses, clinics, very, very important part of psychedelic medicine. It's going to be quite some time before psychedelic medicine is a at-home medicine. This is always going to be about the scene and the setting that's used for delivery of psychedelic medicine. So clinics are very, very important. And then, sort of interesting ancillary businesses could be somebody who's using artificial intelligence to, speed up the drug discovery process, patient support applications. I spoke to a company today who are quite far into their journey of developing music, which is specifically designed to enhance the psychedelic therapy setting. So we're seeing some really interesting ancillary businesses which cut across technology and music and emerging media formats like virtual reality as well.
That's awesome. So if an entrepreneur walks into your office or hops on a Zoom call with you, since we can't walk into each other's offices anymore, and says, hey, I want to build in the psychedelic space, where should I be looking? Where's the white space? What would you tell an aspiring entrepreneur who wants to be in this space? Where would you tell them to be looking?
Well, I mean, if their resume said that they'd spent 20 years at Pfizer or Roche, I would be saying, please go and look for, medical conditions which are currently not yet being serviced by any of the other psychedelic medicine companies, because there are some very interesting ones which are not wholly linked to mental health. It could be addiction, but there's also people developing psychedelics for joint pain. So there is some very interesting niches of a niche, very large niches. But if they were wanting to build something which is more sort of ancillary, then it is a real wide open space. So we at the Conscious Fund, we launched a jobs board, but not like your atypical venture capital jobs board, which is for your portfolio companies. We launched it for every company in the space to put their jobs on it. And so why? So because there wasn't a jobs board, if you wanted to find a job in psychedelic medicine, there isn't one which actually aggregates them all together. So, we rolled our sleeves up and we put that together. So there are so many, whether it's, whether you're an expert at storytelling, communications, PR, IR, there are so many areas.
Where can someone find that job board? Where is that?
That's at the conscious.fund.
I'll link that in the show notes just so people can find it.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's interesting, though, there's a lot of infrastructure around a space like this that hasn't even been built or thought of yet. It's probably that a lot of the innovation will spawn more innovation, and which will spawn more innovation. It's probably that early, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing the first pre-care and post-care mobile services, so people can log into an app and they can chat to the therapist before they go to the therapy center, and they can chat to the therapist after they've been to the therapy center. Companies are developing music programs to enhance the overall setting. at the therapy center and then to sort of help you relive some of that therapy when you go back to the real world. But yeah, it's almost endless in terms of what hasn't yet been done in this category. It's not just companies who are going to be developing medicines. Probably 70% of all the capital, which is going out at the moment, is for that. But there is a lot of valuable companies on the ancillary side of things, the picks and the shovels, which absolutely need to be built for this space, which is going to be a absolutely ginormous category.
What about capital? Is there enough capital flowing into this space? Is there not enough? Should there be a bunch of folks focusing here? If I'm a family office, should I consider doing some homework here? Is it already overcrowded? What's the capital dynamic like in the space right now?
It's an interesting one because, of course, location was very important. If you're European entrepreneurs and you wanted to raise money for a psychedelics company and we weren't living in the middle of a pandemic, you'd have to jump on a plane to Canada, because that's really where most of the capital was being allocated out of. Well, that's changed. I mean, we put on our first of our virtual events under a brand that we have called Microdose in April. And we had a group who emailed us completely out of the blue and said, wow, thank you very much. We were in one of the Slack channels and we raised $1 million in the Slack channel. And we were like, wow. They were just delegates at the event.
Slack should take a carry on it.
Well, I think we should have done. But I was like, wow, that was absolutely brilliant. So, I think right now there's been a bit of a democratization in terms of, you don't have to be in a certain location to raise money. We had a group who presented not so long ago at one of our psychedelic capital events. They closed off $1 million in funding off the back of the presentation that they did at Psychedelic Capital. So it does show there is a lot of early stage capital in the market if you know where to go and look for it. There's only a small number of professional allocators, but you've got pretty heavyweight boutique investment banks. You've got some of the more established investment banks who are talking about this space. And if you were to go and look at the cap table of Atai, Compass, you would see some of the most recognized capital allocators in the venture space who are on their cap table. Generalistic VCs, but they've already started to deploy money into psychedelic medicine.
I'm so new to this space. What am I not asking that I should be asking? I mean, what's the thing you're like, hey, if you knew what you're talking about, you'd be asking me this?
Well, I mean, I think we've covered off some of the sort of the usual elephants in the room, which are, is psychedelic medicine going to struggle in the same way that cannabis did in the US in terms of how it's perceived at a federal level? So that's probably the most common misconception that we have in terms of, how psychedelic medicine will ultimately come to market. We've talked about timelines in terms of, when can we expect to see psychedelic medicine coming into the market? I guess really is to go through maybe the sort of the difference in some of the kind of the drug design, drug discovery companies. There's a preconception that, to get a drug into the market, you can only do it if you've actually got 150 million. That's the commonly accepted number in terms of getting a drug all the way through all of its clinical trial stages. And actually what we're seeing is companies in this space who are looking to raise significantly lower amounts of money, but are not looking to take the drugs all the way through the clinical pathways. They'll get them to, late stage 2, stage 3, and then they will look to either partner with a much larger pharmaceuticals company, or they will look to license or exit that individual compound. So, if somebody is looking at building a boutique drug development company and they've got some very, very smart scientists with them, but they don't necessarily strike you as the group who are going to be able to go out and raise tens of hundreds of millions because, it's very science heavy as a team and there isn't, somebody on the team who's got a background of venture or investment banking. I would say to you that you don't necessarily have to be wholly concerned about that group if you're convinced that they've got very, very strong science behind them. And I guess that then leads to, part of what we have to do as a fund is check, and check again in terms of the level of due diligence that we have to do before we sort of go into a transaction. Because, this isn't like investing into a low-tech company. It's more like investing into a deep tech company. It's not like investing into cannabis. You are ultimately investing into groups who are going to be successful on the basis of the skills of the engineers, the scientists in that business, and their experience of taking drugs all the way through the design and the clinical pathways.
That's really helpful. I mean, this is really informative. I'm really grateful that you came on and were willing to share all this insight with us, because I think a lot of our listeners are curious about the space because of their draw to mental health, but they haven't, figured out how to go do the basic homework to figure out the lay of the land around psychedelics. This is really helpful.
Thank you. I think once you go down the rabbit hole, pardon the pun, there's no turning back. I mean, it's when you start to sort of dig down and you look at the efficacy of psilocybin to deal with any number of different mental health challenges, then you start to say, whoa, hold on. What is holding this back? This makes no sense.
That was my reaction. When I started digging in and making a couple of investments, I was like, what in the world is going on? Who is stopping this? Because this is obviously the answer or one of the answers. And there's got to be people who are disincentivized to see this work.
Yeah, no, it's not a if, it's a when. As we come out of this pandemic, we can unfortunately see another pandemic of mental health. There are then different drivers. If it's insurance companies, they're going to want to lobby for more cost-effective ways of dealing with acute mental health challenges. If it's a state-funded health system that somebody's inside of, then they're going to want to look at ways that they can actually save the state money. So the economic attractiveness of these treatments will start to sort of place pressure. And also because they are brutally effective. You're able to, in some cases, fundamentally change somebody's mental health state of mind with one treatment. And that's really unheard of with conventional therapies. And you're showing very, very high efficacy levels. If you're talking about somebody who's going through addiction, and thank God, in Europe, we haven't really had an opioid crisis, like has happened in the United States. But, you take something like Ibogaine, and you put somebody through a week-long program, and this has been done in places like Mexico and Brazil for quite some time. So there's quite a lot of data out there. You're generally talking of 70-75% efficacy, and that person never returns to opioids. And people who've described the actual treatment actually say it's relatively pleasant. And I think if you've ever spoken to anybody who's, having withdrawal from opioids, the last thing they would do is describe withdrawal from opioids as being relatively pleasant. It's, described as like hell on earth. So it actually makes it a more comfortable procedure to remove somebody from opioid addiction. And it's brutally efficient in terms of ensuring that person doesn't go back to that. So the cost saving to insurers and health services will be astronomical. And I think that will be a large part of the driver. Once we cut past the BS of, these things have been illegal for 40, 50 years, they'll just continue being illegal. That's already kind of, in a way, that's already over and done with. That's kind of gone.
Feels like that ship's already sailed. Like that's going to be legal. It's just a matter of, is it going to be 18 months or 24 months?
Exactly. And then I think the next thing that we'll start to see is more and more work which is being done on creating, and I don't think there's even a label for this yet, non-psychedelic psychedelics. And there's incredible work being done, and it's been sponsored by, organizations even such as DARPA in the US. They've committed $27 million to developing non-psychedelic psychedelics. So, these are things which won't make you trippy, won't make you high, but will actually give all of the same benefits And it's yet to be seen if it can be achieved. There are definitely two schools of thought. You've got groups who strongly believe you need to have the spiritual experience, you need the trip for it to work. And you have other groups who say, actually, we think we can do exactly the same, but we don't need that to occur. So there's work already occurring on that. And if that's proven to be correct, then, all of a sudden take back everything that I said with regards to you have to be in a clinic setting for these things to be correctly administered. Because we could actually find that there are treatment programs which can be done with remote therapy, just at-home use medicines. And that's going to be, I think, again, quite some time before that starts to come to fruition.
I agree with you that we do go there, though. I with either whether it's sound or whether it's maybe vibrations or music or some other electromagnetic sort of stimulation, or maybe it's even some other substance. I don't know for sure, but I do believe we go there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that, again, I think it's going to take time and some incredibly smart people. One of the companies that we've backed are actually working on that type of initiative.
Well, then let me into their next round.
I'd say that's almost one of the red or black investments that we've made, because if they can do it, then that's absolutely amazing. It's a fundamental game change. It's a amazing IP that they've created. It's a fantastically good business to humankind. And if they don't, well, it was definitely worth trying.
That's part of what we're doing in this space. Is there's a social impact here of if we fail, at least we know, and we help humans get better next time. So, there's more going on in our space than just making money. I think that's very important for people to understand.
That's absolutely. And I think a lot of when you talk to, sort of the LP community about this, you get two types. You get one who, it's like they know nothing about it, but they're willing to take a call and they're interested. And then you get another type who will spend a bit of time getting to know you, chatting about your life, and then all of a sudden they'll drop something in at the conversation. They'll say, I once had a trip to Peru. Or I've read the entire works of Terence McKenna, and you think, okay, I know exactly what you're telling me here. We're on the same level. So, and of course, both groups are equally useful. You need to win people over who know nothing about it. In fact, part of what we do for our investment process is actually bring all of our LPs into the decision-making process, partly so they can actually learn more, because we are talking about a commercial space which is, really sub a year old. So you want people to be able to access more information and to learn more and share more. And actually Rick Doblin from MAPS said, in a similar way that people, there was a movement of people who came out, and said, I'm gay. He said, you need to have a similar thing with psychedelics. People need to be comfortable saying, I've tried psychedelics. They worked for me. They really, really worked, and are prepared to sort of, stand up and tell that story. Because of course, you've got the stigma of mental health, and then you sort of have people who've then got to sort of say, oh yeah, I went away and had magic mushrooms and it made it all better. And then people are looking at them going, all right, okay, I wonder if it has. So, you've got there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I've seen it. Again, you look at quite conservative European countries where things like CBD have become widely accepted and widely used by everybody from teenagers to senior citizens. And you've got people who are 80 years of age, had no connection to cannabis through their entire life, who all of a sudden feel quite comfortable telling all of their neighbors that they now use cannabis.
Yeah. I mean, I think the stigma is decreasing, and I think talking about it and encouraging people to talk about it's really the original premise of this podcast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when we get to a point where people feel comfortable talking about mental health, challenges, and then, feel more comfortable sharing the ways that they've managed to, find help, then that's only going to help other people. That is one of the challenges that's going to have to be overcome with psychedelics. Got to be, we do live in a little bit of a bubble because it's kind of like all we talk about all day with, for what we do. But, there is obviously a much broader group of people. But what's been fascinating is the types of people who have embraced psychedelic therapy, and you look at the work that MAPS have done, and they are taking police officers through their programs. They're taking veterans through their programs.
And one of the things I want to point out there is that they're taking veterans and the government's paying for that.
That's correct.
So the U.S. government, where this is illegal, and some people say, well, maybe it won't become legal. Maybe it'll be like marijuana. Maybe it'll just be a state thing. The federal government is paying for MAPS to treat veterans. So you tell me, does that sound like it's on the path to approval or not?
And DARPA have just put $27 million into the development of non-psychedelic psychedelics, or non-psychoactive psychedelics, I think is probably the proper way of framing it. But, and the US Army is doing work around it. One of the companies that we backed, is developing novel ways of ketamine being administered in a battlefield pain environment. So, it's without a doubt, I can say with complete and utter conviction that psychedelic medicine is 100% here to stay. It will be a federally approved medicine. It will be a European medicines approved medicine. It's just going to be a question of, the time that's needed. And then, a reprogramming, a re-education of people, because we have been told for the last 40, 50 years that these things are bad, these things are mad, you shouldn't go anywhere near them. And we stopped doing all the very, very valuable work around how they can help people. And now we've just, really just restarted that. And we've got to sort of change that narrative in terms of, what you can actually do with psychedelic medicine.
Well, look, I'm really grateful to have you come here. I know we're at the end of our time, and I just wanted to say thank you again for coming on and sharing your insights. Honestly, we should probably do 2 or 3 of these conversations. There's just so much to unpack here, and I consider you to be one of the experts in this space that I lean on to learn and to meet founders in and to figure out what's going on. So I appreciate you helping me and helping our listeners.
No, thank you very much.
I wanted to give another special thank you to our guest, Richard, for being here today and sharing with us. I think a lot of people, a lot of founders, a lot of investors will find this sort of psychedelic primer really helpful. So thank you again for doing that. To our listeners, thank you for being here. And please, if you like the content, hook us up with a subscribe or a like or a review on your podcast platform of choice. And we'd love it if you'd share us with a friend. If you'd like to support us and the content we create, then you can find us on Patreon as well. We'll provide a link to that in the show notes. On that Patreon page, we provide additional insights, thought pieces, research, public company analysis, etc. for our loyal supporters. So like I said, I'll link to that in the show notes. To our founders in the mental health space, don't forget to join the Mental Health Startup Community Slack channel. You can find a link to that in the show notes. And we have a new segment launching soon on the podcast here, probably right around the time this episode goes live, called The Founder Spotlight, which will be an episode that consists of 5 3-minute pitches from founders in the mental health space. Nothing is filtered. Nothing is edited. It's just 5 3-minute pitches where, our intent is to leverage our platform to bring more awareness to more founders. So look for a link in the show notes. You can sign up to be a part of that. Instructions will follow. Most importantly, we really want to hear from you broadly. So please do comment on social media. Let us know what you liked, what you want to hear more of, what you disagreed with. You can reach out to us on Twitter at StigmaCast, Instagram at StigmaPodcast. You can email us info@stigmapodcast.com. Thank you again for being here, and that's it. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thank you for your support.